Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. 61 years my family held that lease, and my son-in-law sold it in front of a television camera before I'd even reached the dock. The Stevensons are retiring, folks. 61 years, and Gulf Tide is honored to carry the tradition forward, Rodrigo said, smiling for the news crew, while I stood in the crowd. He hadn't noticed yet. My hands were shaking, but I didn't shout. I didn't correct him, not yet. So I walked straight past the cameras, past my own daughter's frozen face, and I found the one woman in this town who still knew exactly how paperwork could be undone. But that walk came later. First, there was the morning itself, bright and salted, the kind of morning Apalachicola only gives you a handful of times each fall. Boats lined the seawall with their hulls freshly scrubbed, ropes coiled the way I had taught half these captains to coil them. Father Dubois stood on the platform with his stole snapping in the wind, waiting to bless the fleet the way his predecessor had blessed it, and his predecessor before that, going back longer than anyone in town could account for with certainty. I had come, same as every year, to stand near the front with my thermos of black coffee and watch the water. I wasn't expecting a microphone. I wasn't expecting Rodrigo in a pressed blue shirt that cost more than a week of dock fees to climb onto the platform beside Father Dubois with a folder tucked under one arm. He tapped the microphone twice. The crowd quieted the way a crowd does when it senses good news coming, an announcement about a scholarship, a new ice house, something to clap for before the boats headed out. I clapped too, at first, before I understood what I was clapping for. He said the words about 61 years and Gulf Tide, and for one full second I believed I had misheard him the way you believe you've misheard a diagnosis before the second sentence confirms the first. Then he lifted a folder and held it toward the camera, a folder with a seal on it I recognized, the county seal, the Port Authority seal, the kind of seal that means a signature already exists somewhere beneath it. Effective this week, he said, the Stevenson dock lease transfers to Gulf Tide Holdings, ensuring this harbor has the resources to modernize for the next generation of watermen. The applause came in pieces, some of it real, from people who trusted the word transfer more than they trusted their own unease. Some of it uncertain hands, half-raised eyes searching the crowd for me, because everybody on that seawall had known my name longer than they had known Rodrigo's. I found Avery in the crowd before she found me. My daughter stood near the bait shop with her phone gripped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, and for one moment our eyes met across all those strangers. She didn't walk toward me. She turned, and she was gone into the side street before I could call her name, leaving me to wonder which version of this morning she had known about and for how long. Rodrigo stepped down from the platform, still smiling, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from men who had no idea what they were congratulating him for. He hadn't seen me yet. I could have let him keep not seeing me. Instead, I walked toward him slow, the way I walk a deck in rough water, because panic is what drowns a man, not the water itself. He turned when the crowd near him went quiet, and his smile held for exactly as long as it takes a man to remember a lie he has already told out loud in front of witnesses. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know you'd be down here this early." "I have come to this dock every morning for 44 years, I said. "Every morning, Rodrigo. There was no early for me to be." He glanced at the camera crew still packing their equipment 20 feet away, close enough to hear if either of us raised our voice. "This isn't the place," he said quietly. "We can talk at the house." "There's no house conversation that explains a folder with a county seal on it," I said. "Not one you didn't already plan to have without me in the room." He opened his mouth, and for a moment I thought something honest might come out of it. Some fragment of the boy who used to wait for me at the end of this same dock with his mother's sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Then his jaw set, and whatever had almost surfaced went back under. "Melissa's brother handles the paperwork," he said, as though a name could stand in for an explanation. "You'll understand once you've seen the numbers." I didn't want his numbers. I wanted the sound of my own bell, the one I had rung every morning of my working life. One ring for the tide, one for the boats still out, one for the ones already home. And I understood, standing there with the applause still fading behind me, that Rodrigo had just rung it once for himself and called it tradition. I didn't shout. I didn't correct him in front of the cameras, though every part of me wanted to. I turned instead, and I walked past the folding chairs and the coolers and the tourists filming boats they would never learn the names of, toward the clinic 3 streets back, where I had a cardiac follow-up already on the books, and nowhere else in this town left that felt entirely like mine. The waiting room at Forgotten Coast Cardiology smelled like every waiting room I had ever sat in. Antiseptic and old coffee, and for once, I was grateful for something that predictable. I checked in at the desk, gave my name, and sat in a corner chair with my hands still not entirely steady. My appointment wasn't for another 20 minutes. I intended to spend them staring at the carpet and thinking about nothing at all, which is a harder thing to do than most people realize. I heard her before I saw her. A woman's voice, thin but unmistakably sharp, coming from the row of chairs near the window. "I am not signing anything today, Alonzo. I told you that in the car, and I am telling you again in front of these strangers, since apparently that's the only audience you respect." The man beside her wore a gray suit that fit him a little too well for a Tuesday morning in a coastal clinic, and he held a folder of his own, the kind with a clear plastic sleeve on the front for a printed name. Driftwood Manor, it read, beneath a photograph of a building that looked more like a resort than anything else. "Aunt Nola," he said, using the word the way some men use a crowbar. "The doctor already agrees that living alone isn't safe anymore. I'm only trying to make this easier." "You are trying to make it faster," she said. "There's a difference, and you know it." I recognized something in her voice, a kind of controlled fury I had heard in my own throat not 2 hours earlier. I found myself watching, without meaning to, the way you watch weather building over water, unable to look away, even when you already know how it ends. Alonzo slid the folder toward her lap. "The paperwork just needs your signature and we can process the transfer this week. Driftwood has an opening. Those don't come along often." "An opening," she repeated, "that appeared the same month I turned down your developer's offer on the eastern acreage. Funny how quickly a room becomes available once a person becomes inconvenient." He glanced around the waiting room, aware now that other people were listening, myself included. "You're confused," he said gentler now, performing gentleness for an audience. "That's exactly the kind of thinking the doctor mentioned." Something in me still raw from the doc from Rodrigo's folder, with its county seal, recognized the shape of what I was watching. Before I understood, I recognized it. I stood up before I had fully decided to. "Sorry I'm late," I said, crossing the room. "Traffic on the bridge was worse than they said it'd be." The old woman looked up at me, gray eyes moving from my face to my hands to whatever expression I was wearing, and something in her calculated fast enough that I nearly missed it. "You're always late," she said without missing a beat. "Sit down before you make a scene." Alonzo's smile faltered by exactly the width of a man reconsidering his math. "And you are—" "Her nephew," I said. "Her late husband's side. We don't see each other as often as we should, which she reminds me of constantly." "I don't recall a nephew," he said. "You wouldn't," she said. "You only started attending family functions once you learned what a power of attorney is." A nurse appeared in the doorway with a clipboard calling a name that wasn't mine, then pausing when she took in the 3 of us. "Everything all right over here?" "This gentleman," Alonzo said, recovering his footing, "is interfering with a family medical decision." "I'm sitting with my aunt," I said, "who has told him twice now that she isn't signing anything." The nurse looked at Nola directly, the way good nurses learn to past whoever else is in the room. "Ma'am, do you want to sign these forms today?" "I do not," Nola said, "and I'd like it noted in whatever chart you people keep that I said so clearly sober and without assistance." The nurse wrote something down and looked at Alonzo with the particular patience of a woman who has had this exact conversation with other families before. "We can't process a transfer without consent." You're welcome to discuss it with her physician directly. Alonzo closed his folder with a soft, controlled snap. The sound of a man choosing not to fight in front of witnesses a second time in one day. This isn't finished, he told her, and then, glancing at me, whoever you are, you have no idea what you've involved yourself in. He left without waiting for an answer, his shoes loud against the linoleum until the door swallowed the sound behind him. Nola exhaled slowly, the fight leaving her shoulders all at once. And for the first time she really looked at me, gray eyes sharp beneath the fluorescent lights. "You're the man from the dock this morning," she said. "I heard the whole waiting room talking about it before you'd even sat down." I didn't answer right away. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "I'm sorry you had to live it," she said, and there was no performance left in her voice at all. "Sit with me until my appointment. Then you're coming to the house. You look like a man with nowhere in particular to be tonight, and I have a guest cottage no one's used since my husband died." I opened my mouth to refuse out of habit more than conviction, and found I didn't have the strength to finish the sentence. The guest cottage sat behind Nola's net shed, close enough to the tidal creek that I could hear the water working against the pilings all night. She'd set her housekeeper, a quiet woman named Dot, to bring me a toothbrush and a folded towel, as though hosting strangers displaced by their own families was a routine errand in this house. Maybe it was. I didn't ask. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled out my phone, the one thing I'd had in my pocket since the dock that morning, and opened the Port Authority portal the way I had 1,000 times before to check the lease status, the way another man might check the weather. The screen returned an error. Instead of a login field, access denied, contact your account administrator for assistance. I tried again, slower this time, in case my hands had simply moved wrong. The same words appeared, patient and final. The kind of message that isn't a glitch so much as a decision someone else made about you. I called the harbor office next, more out of habit than hope, and reached only the after-hours recording. Then I did the thing I should have done hours earlier and opened the banking app that handled the boat maintenance account, the one Avery had helped me set up 2 winters back so she could pay dock contractors without waiting on me to sign a check every time. The account loaded slower than usual, as if it too were deciding whether to let me in. The balance was there. So was the transaction history. 3 lines down from the top, time-stamped just after 9 that morning. Hours before the festival, hours before Rodrigo had ever climbed onto that platform, was a cash withdrawal for $11,000, processed at the branch on Avenue D, authorized under Avery's name. I read it twice, certain I'd misunderstood the number, the way I'd been certain that morning I'd misheard Rodrigo. I hadn't misunderstood either time. There was no note attached to the withdrawal, no memo line explaining itself, just a number and a name and a timestamp that placed my daughter at a bank teller's window before the sun had fully cleared the water, moving $11,000 out of an account that would be frozen to me completely by that same afternoon. I sat with the phone in both hands, the way you'd hold something that might still be hot. 2 versions of Avery stood side by side in my mind, and I couldn't get either one to leave. One version had known exactly what Rodrigo planned, and had positioned herself to benefit from it before the doors closed. The other version had seen the same doors closing, and had grabbed what she could reach not for herself, but because $11,000 gone quietly is $11,000 that never has to become a court exhibit. I didn't know which daughter I'd raised. That not knowing sat heavier in my chest than the withdrawal itself. I thought of a kitchen table 30 years back. Avery, no older than 10, balancing her own paper checkbook because I'd told her a person should always know exactly how much of her own money she had before she spent a dime of it. She used to line the numbers up so carefully the columns looked drawn with a ruler. I had been proud of that, the way you're proud of a thing you assume will simply carry forward on its own without needing tending. Somewhere between that kitchen table and this cottage, she had learned to move $11,000 out of sight in under an hour, and I couldn't say which lesson of mine had taught her that. Nola appeared in the cottage doorway without knocking, a cardigan thrown over her nightgown, moving with the unhurried confidence of a woman who'd stopped apologizing for interrupting people decades ago. "You've got the look of a man who found something he didn't want to find," she said. I turned the phone toward her without a word. She studied the screen for longer than it should have taken to read one line of numbers, her expression giving away nothing, until she finally spoke. "People don't empty an account they don't already know is about to disappear," she said. "Whatever else your daughter is, Arthur, she isn't a woman who was surprised this morning." "You don't know that." "I don't," she agreed. "But I've spent 41 years reading records for a living, and every fraud I ever untangled had one honest person standing close enough to see it coming, and far enough away to pretend they hadn't. That's usually where the real story hides. Not with the man holding the folder, with the person standing quietly beside him deciding how much of the truth she can survive telling." "You said 41 years," I said, "reading records." 41 years at the clerk's office before I retired, and another decade since spent watching men like Alonzo assume retirement made me slower instead of just quieter. She lowered herself into the room's one chair, her cardigan pulled tight. "I've seen daughters who stole from their fathers and never blinked. I've also seen daughters who moved money the way you'd pull a child back from a curb too fast to explain themselves too late to undo what was already coming. The paperwork looks identical either way, Arthur. That's what makes it dangerous. You won't know which one you're dealing with from a bank statement. You'll only know it from her. And if I ask her and she lies to me again, then you'll know something too," Nola said, "just not the thing you were hoping for." I looked back down at the number on the screen at my daughter's name attached to it, and understood that whatever I found next, I would have to find it without knowing yet whether Avery belonged on my side of this fight or on Rodrigo's. My phone woke me before the sun did. 3 messages stacked on the screen in the order Rodrigo must have typed them, each one arriving a few minutes apart, as though he'd composed them, reconsidered, and sent them anyway. The first read, "I told the crew you already knew about the transfer. Don't make me look like a liar in front of the harbor board." The second read, "This isn't personal, Dad. The lease was going to come to me eventually. This just moves the timeline up." The third arrived while I was still staring at the second. "The paperwork is signed. It's done. Fighting it just costs everyone money we don't have." I read all 3 twice before I trusted myself to sit up. Outside the cottage window, the creek had gone the color of pewter, that flat gray it takes on before full light, and somewhere down the bank, a heron was working the shallows the way it did every morning, whether or not my life had come apart the day before. I didn't answer any of the 3 messages. Part of me wanted to call him and ask plainly which sentence he expected me to believe, the one where the lease was always going to be his, or the one where fighting it only cost money we didn't have, as if those were 2 different excuses reaching for the same conclusion. I thought of teaching him to splice a line when he was 19, showing him the same knot 4 separate times before his hands finally understood what his eyes had already seen. I wondered when patience like that had stopped being something he wanted from me. A 4th message arrived while I was still holding the phone. This one not from Rodrigo, but from an address I didn't recognize, a title company 2 counties over. The subject line read, "Closing Disclosure, 118 Harbor Point Lease." I opened it, standing barefoot on the cottage floor, cold planks under my feet, and read a paragraph that named Gulf Tide Holdings as the incoming leaseholder, listed a closing date 9 days out, and described the current holder, meaning me, as voluntarily transitioning operational responsibility due to health considerations per attached documentation. Attached documentation. I hadn't attached anything to anyone. Nola was already at her kitchen table when I came up from the cottage, a pot of coffee between us, and a legal pad in front of her with 2 words written at the top in handwriting steadier than mine. Gulf Tide. She'd clearly been awake longer than I had. "Show me," she said, and I turned the email toward her the way I'd turned the bank statement the night before, this house apparently becoming the place where I brought her every piece of paper meant to end me quietly. She read it once, unhurried, then set the phone down and looked at me over her glasses. "Everyone in this story keeps saying the same word, transfer, transition. Nobody says sale. Nobody says who's actually receiving money and how much." She tapped the pad. So before we ask what they did, we ask the only question that ever matters in a case like this. Who is Gulf Tide Holdings? I don't know. Neither do they, apparently, since they haven't bothered introducing themselves. She pulled a laptop across the table, ancient by any modern standard, and typed with 2 fingers and the patience of a woman who had once made a living waiting for slower machines than this. The state's business registry loaded plain and gray, nothing like the glossy folder Rodrigo had carried onto that platform. She searched the name. One result appeared. Gulf Tide Holdings, LLC, registered 11 weeks earlier, a post office box for an address, a registered agent whose name meant nothing to either of us, yet though Nola wrote it on the pad anyway, underlining it twice. 11 weeks, she said. Your son-in-law didn't wake up angry one morning and decide to sell your lease. Somebody built the container to put it in months before he ever climbed onto that platform with a folder. I thought of the camera crew, the seal on Rodrigo's papers, the ease with which he'd said the words this week, as though the timeline had simply arrived on its own. 11 weeks did not sound like weather. It sounded like a plan someone had been quietly assembling while I was still teaching him to coil rope the way his own father never had. Nola reached across the table and turned her wall calendar to the current month, the kind with a fishing boat photograph above each set of dates, and found the day 9 squares ahead. She circled it in red ink hard enough that the pen nearly tore the paper. 9 days, she said. That's how long we have before whatever they're calling this becomes very difficult to undo. I looked at that red circle sitting on an ordinary Tuesday, a date that had meant nothing to me a week ago, and now sat between me and everything I'd spent 61 years building, and understood that grief, when it comes wearing a deadline, doesn't leave you time to feel it properly before it starts asking you to act. My first instinct, sitting there with the calendar between us, was to reach for my own phone and start making calls myself, the harbor board, the title company, anyone who might listen to a man explain his own life in his own words before somebody else explained it for him. Nola watched me reach for it, and without a word put her hand flat on the table between me and the phone, the way you'd stop a man from stepping onto ice you'd already tested. Not yet, she said. 9 days is enough time to do this carefully. It is not enough time to do it alone and carefully both. You'll have to choose one. I didn't answer her right away. 44 years of counting that bell by myself, of deciding alone which lines to cut and which to save when a storm came through the harbor, had taught me that the fastest way through trouble was straight through it with nobody's hands on the wheel but mine. I wasn't ready yet to admit that this particular storm might require a different kind of navigation. The Franklin County Port Authority office occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a bank once, judging by the vault door still standing open in the back corner, repurposed now to store nothing more valuable than filing boxes. Nola walked in ahead of me with her cane striking the tile in a rhythm that sounded less like a woman needing support and more like a woman announcing her arrival. Mrs. Fleming, the clerk at the front counter said, glancing up before Nola had even reached the desk. You're back. I am, Nola said. And I've brought a project with me this time instead of just opinions about how you've reorganized the filing system since I retired. The clerk, a younger woman with a name tag reading Priscilla, smiled the way people smile at someone they respect and slightly fear in equal measure. What are we looking for? Lease transfer filings. Harbor Point Slip 14. Anything recorded in the last month. Priscilla directed us to a public terminal along the back wall, one of 2 computers in the building that looked newer than the decade I'd been alive when the vault door was still locked at night. Nola sat down in front of it the way another person might sit down at a piano they'd played for 40 years, fingers finding the keys before her mind had fully caught up. They digitized most of this in 2011. She said more to herself than to me. But they kept the physical originals in the annex for anything filed before that, and half the clerks working here now don't know the physical file even exists. That's usually where people hide things they don't expect anyone to go looking for. She searched the lease record, first pulling up the same transfer language I'd read in the title company's email, dated and stamped 2 days before the festival. Beneath it, a second document had been attached, one I hadn't seen before. A certificate of successor operator, it was called, filed under the harbor's succession statute, the same statute that let a lease pass to a designated party if the current holder became medically unable to manage it. "There," Nola said, and turned the screen toward me. The certificate named Rodrigo as successor operator effective immediately on the grounds of medical incapacity. Attached beneath it, scanned in gray and slightly crooked, as if it had been photographed rather than properly copied, sat a letter on medical letterhead. Coastal Cardiology Associates, Dr. Fernando McDaniel. I had known Fernando McDaniel for 11 years. He'd treated my heart the way another man might tend a boat he genuinely cared whether or not sank, checking in on me at the hardware store, asking after my blood pressure the way most people ask after the weather. 3 winters back, when Lorelei's second surgery had left me sitting in a waiting room I couldn't seem to stand up from, Fernando had come out in his scrubs on his own lunch break just to sit with me for 10 minutes, saying nothing useful, saying nothing that needed to be useful. I read the letter twice, the same way I'd read the bank statement, the same way I'd read Rodrigo's texts, certain each time that a third reading might reveal a different set of words than the first 2 had shown me. The letter stated that I suffered from progressive cognitive decline. It stated that I was, in the doctor's professional opinion, no longer capable of managing complex financial and operational decisions. It carried a signature that looked at a glance exactly like the signature I'd watched Fernando scrawl across a dozen prescription pads over a decade of appointments. "I saw him 3 weeks ago," I said, "for my regular checkup. He never said a word about this. We talked about my cholesterol. He teased me for remembering the numbers better than he did. Did he examine you for cognitive decline at that appointment?" "No, there was nothing to examine. There's nothing wrong with my mind." Nola leaned closer to the screen, studying the signature the way she'd once studied thousands of documents for a living, searching for the particular tells a trained eye learns to catch and an untrained one walks straight past. "The letterhead is real," she said. "I'd bet the practice's own printer produced it. But look here at the date. Filed 2 days before your procedure was even scheduled, before the festival, before any of this became public. Somebody built this letter the same 11 weeks ago they built the company waiting to receive your lease." Priscilla printed a copy for us at the counter, the machine humming out 3 pages that felt, in my hands, considerably heavier than paper should. I stood there holding proof that someone had used a doctor I trusted to manufacture a version of me that didn't exist, a version confused and incapable, built entirely out of a signature I now couldn't stop staring at. "Fernando needs to see this," I said. "He does," Nola agreed. "But first we need to understand exactly how far this reaches, because a man capable of forging a physician's letter 11 weeks in advance did not stop planning after he wrote it." My hands had gone cold, holding those 3 pages, colder than the morning air in that old bank lobby had any right to make them. And for the first time since the dock, since the withdrawal, since the calendar with its red circle, I understood that what I was facing wasn't a single betrayal. It was a structure built carefully, with my own name load-bearing at its center. Nola insisted on driving us straight from the recorder's office to the dock. No stop at the cottage, no stop to call anyone first, though she was the one who'd said the words carefully just an hour earlier. I didn't remind her of her own advice. I was too busy watching the harbor come into view through her windshield, and the sight waiting for us there put every careful plan out of my head entirely. A flatbed truck sat parked across 2 boat slips, and 2 men in matching gray shirts were bolting a new sign onto the post at the head of my own dock, the one I'd sunk into the mud myself the same year I married Lorelei. "Gulf Tide Marine Operations," the sign read, in lettering large enough to be read from the water. A handful of fishermen stood along the seawall, watching, arms crossed, the way men watch weather they can't yet decide whether to trust. I was out of Nola's car before she'd fully stopped it. "Stop what you're doing," I said, crossing the gravel toward the 2 men, my voice louder than I'd meant it to come out. "This dock isn't Gulf Tides to post signs on." The taller of the 2 workers held up both hands, not unkindly. "We were told the transfer's already filed, sir. We're just following the work order." "The transfer is built on a forged medical letter," I said. "I can show you the paperwork myself if you'd like to see exactly whose signature got copied to make it happen." That drew more attention than I'd intended. Ray Delgado, who'd fished this harbor longer than Rodrigo had been alive, stepped away from the seawall and closer to us. "Arthur, what in God's name is going on? Man came by yesterday saying you'd retired." "I didn't retire," I said. "I was told I had on a Tuesday morning by a man holding a folder with a county seal on it." A truck door slammed behind me before I could say more. Rodrigo came across the gravel-fast Avery a few steps behind him, and I watched my daughter's face carefully as she approached the same frozen look she'd worn at the festival, now sharpened by something closer to dread. "You can't be here causing a scene," Rodrigo said low, aware of Ray and the other men watching. "This is exactly the kind of behavior the doctor's letter—" "Which doctor?" I said. "And which letter, Rodrigo? Say it out loud, here where these men can hear you, the way you said it in front of the cameras." He glanced at the workers, then at Ray calculating an audience the way he'd calculated one at the festival, and I could see him deciding how much of the truth this particular crowd required. "Dr. McDaniel provided documentation of your cognitive decline. It's a matter of medical record. Dr. McDaniel saw me 3 weeks ago and discussed my cholesterol," I said. "He never examined me for cognitive decline because there was nothing to examine." "Who signed his name to that letter, Rodrigo?" His jaw tightened. For 1/2 second no longer, his eyes moved off me and found Avery standing behind him. A glance so brief I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't spent 40 years reading small movements on rough water for a living. The kind of glance a man gives when he's checking whether someone else in the room already knows more than they're supposed to. Avery didn't meet his eyes. She looked at the gravel instead, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm morning, and said nothing at all, which told me almost as much as the glance had. "The letter is accurate," Rodrigo said, recovering. "You're standing here right now arguing with your own son-in-law in front of half the harbor, Dad. If that isn't a demonstration of exactly the kind of impaired judgment the letter describes, I don't know what would be." Something in me went cold and quiet at that, quieter than the anger I'd expected to feel. Because for half a breath standing there with Ray watching and my own daughter refusing to look at me, I wondered if he might be right. I was 71 years old. My hands had been shaking since the moment I woke up 2 days ago. Maybe a younger man's confidence was exactly what this harbor needed, and I was simply too stubborn or too old to see that I'd become the obstacle in my own story. I didn't say any of that out loud. I straightened instead the way I straighten on deck when a swell catches me off guard, and turned to the men still holding their drill. "Take the sign down," I said, "or leave it lying in the gravel. Either way, it doesn't go up today." The taller worker looked at Rodrigo, then at the growing knot of fishermen along the seawall, and made his decision without needing to be told twice. He set the drill down. Rodrigo watched his sign stay grounded, watched Ray Delgado's face harden into something closer to suspicion than sympathy, and understood. I think that he'd lost this particular morning, even if he hadn't lost the war. He stepped close enough that only I could hear him clearly. "You're going to regret making this public, old man," he said, quiet and even, none of the performance left in his voice at all. "You have no idea who's actually behind this, or how far it goes past me." Then he turned, took Avery by the arm, and walked back toward his truck without waiting to see whether I had anything left to say. Regina Reese kept an office above the old hardware store on Market Street, 2 rooms, with water-stained ceiling tiles and a window unit that rattled every few minutes like it was clearing its throat. Nola had called ahead from the car, and by the time we climbed the narrow stairs, Regina already had a legal pad open on her desk, with a single word written at the top, underlined twice. Harbor. She was younger than I expected a lawyer recommended by a 93-year-old former county clerk to be. Maybe 58, with cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up into it, and she listened to the whole account without interrupting once, the way I imagine a good surgeon listens before ever picking up a scalpel. I told her about the festival, the folder with the seal, the frozen accounts, Avery's withdrawal, the forged letter from Fernando McDaniel, the sign at the dock. Nola added only what she'd personally witnessed at the recorder's office, nothing more. When I finished, Regina set down her pen and removed her glasses entirely, folding them once before she spoke. "Mr. Stevenson, I need to say something clearly because I don't think you've had anyone say it to you plainly yet. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement that got out of hand. It's forgery of a medical document, misuse of a court-recognized succession statute, and what looks very much like an attempt to fraudulently transfer a federally regulated harbor lease using falsified capacity documentation. Depending on how the county and the Coast Guard's Marine Facilities Office choose to classify it, some of what you've described could constitute wire fraud, given the electronic filings involved." I sat with those words for a moment before I trusted myself to respond. "You're saying this is criminal." "I'm saying a prosecutor would very likely agree that it is," she said, "which is different from a guarantee, but not by much given what's already sitting on my desk." She tapped the printed capacity certificate with one finger. "This document alone, if the physician confirms he didn't write it, gives us grounds to void the succession claim outright. Combine that with the timeline on the shell company and the bank withdrawal, and you're no longer looking at a family dispute a mediator could smooth over in an afternoon. You're looking at a paper trail a grand jury could follow with very little help from either of us." "He's my son-in-law." "I understand that," Regina said, and something in her tone told me she meant it not as comfort, but as acknowledgement of a fact that wouldn't change what came next. "I can't make the legal reality gentler because of who committed it. What I can do is make sure the next 9 days work in your favor instead of his." I sat back in the hard office chair and let the word criminal settle over me the way cold water settles into a boot before you can feel your foot go numb. I had spent 18 years watching Rodrigo become part of this family, from the nervous young man who'd asked my permission before proposing to Avery, into someone who could stand on a platform and lie to an entire town without his voice shaking once. Somewhere in those 18 years, I had missed the exact moment when disappointment stopped being the worst word available to describe what he'd become. Nola leaned forward. "Where do we start with the closing itself?" "I'll contact the title company today and put them on notice that the underlying capacity certificate is disputed and potentially fraudulent. Most title companies will pause a closing rather than risk liability once they hear the word forgery from an attorney instead of a family member. Second, I want a written statement from Dr. McDaniel confirming he never authored that letter as soon as you can get one. Third, we request an independent capacity evaluation for you promptly, so nobody can argue later that we delayed because we were afraid of the results." "I'm not afraid of the results," I said. "Good," Regina said. "Then it costs you nothing to get them quickly, and it costs Rodrigo everything because right now his entire position depends on you never actually being evaluated by someone he doesn't control." I thought of Rodrigo's voice at the dock, low and certain, telling me I had no idea who was actually behind this. I hadn't repeated that part to Regina yet. "There's something else," I said, and told her about the warning, the way his confidence hadn't cracked so much as shifted, like a man reminding himself of resources still held in reserve. Regina wrote a few words on her pad, unhurried, and looked up at me over the rim of her glasses. 11 weeks to build a shell company, a forged physician's letter, and a public announcement timed to a community festival. That's not the profile of a son-in-law acting alone out of desperation. That's the profile of someone who had help structuring this, and probably financing it too. I'd like to know who before we walk into any courtroom." My phone rang before I could answer her, the screen showing a number I didn't recognize, out of state, and for one unreasonable second, I thought of Rodrigo again, of Gulf Tide's registered agent, of whatever reserve of help he'd been threatening me with at the dock. "Go ahead and answer it," Nola said. "Rodrigo doesn't call from numbers he thinks you won't recognize. He calls from his own." I answered on the 4th ring, and the young woman's voice came through unsteady, older than the last time I'd heard it, and frightened enough to erase almost a year of silence in a single word. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" she said again when I didn't answer fast enough. "It's Layla. Please don't hang up." I hadn't moved. Regina and Nola both went quiet, watching me the way people watch a man receive news they can tell matters before they know what it is. "I'm here," I said. "I'm not going to hang up. Dad called me. He said you disappeared from the hospital thing with some woman trying to take your doc. He said you've lost it, Grandpa. He said I shouldn't call you because it would only confuse you more." Her voice cracked on the last word, older than I remembered it, and 11 months of silence sat between us like a door neither of us had been the one to close. Though I'd spent most of that time believing otherwise. "I haven't lost anything except patience with your father," I said. "Layla, I saw the sign at the dock this morning. It said Gulf Tide. Does that name mean anything to you?" A long pause, long enough that I heard her breathing change. "Where did you see that?" "On my own dock, being bolted onto my own post 3 hours ago." "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to actually listen before you decide what kind of person I am, because Dad's had almost a year to tell you a version of me that isn't true." "I'm listening." "The ring," she said. "Grandma Lorelei's ring. The one that went missing after I visited 2 years ago. Dad told you I pawned it. He showed you a receipt with my name on it." I remembered that receipt with a clarity that still stung, the way certain betrayals stay sharper in memory than kinder things ever do. "He did." "I didn't take it," Layla said. "Mom did. She needed cash for a supplier deposit on one of Dad's jobs, and she used an old ID of mine that still had my maiden information on the account because the pawn shop wouldn't process a repeat transaction under her own name that month. I found out afterward. I confronted her. She cried and said she'd fix it before you noticed, and then Dad told you it was me and you believed him, and I lost almost a year of my life because I was 22 and easy to blame." I sat with that for a long moment, Regina's office rattling quietly around me, and felt something shift loose in my chest that I hadn't realized was still lodged there. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" "I tried," she said. "I called. You didn't pick up. I texted and the messages showed delivered, but you never answered. Dad said you'd changed your number after everything happened, said you didn't want contact with me until I returned the ring or admitted what I'd done. I believed him because why would a father lie about something like that?" Neither of us needed to say the rest out loud. We had both spent 11 months being lied to by the same man in 2 different directions. Each of us told the other one had chosen the silence. "There's more," Layla said, quieter now. 2 years ago, before any of this, Mom borrowed my laptop while their computer was in the shop. She hooked it up to the family printer, and I found out later everything scanned on that printer saved automatically to a shared cloud folder. I looked through it once, mostly invoices, nothing that meant anything to me at the time. I should have looked harder. "What are you telling me, Layla?" "I don't know exactly what's in there," she said, "but I know it's more than invoices, and I know Dad's been careless about what he prints. If there's a paper trail behind whatever they did to you, some of it might still be sitting in that folder, and I still have the login." I thought of Regina's warning not 20 minutes earlier. Someone had helped structuring this, and probably financing it too, and felt the shape of the case widening in a direction I hadn't expected it to go. "There's one more thing," she said, and her voice thinned out entirely. "Dad stopped paying my tuition in the spring, right after I started asking questions about the accounts. I've been working nights at a rehab center to cover the difference. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand I have nothing left to lose by telling you the truth now, and that's exactly why you can trust it." Regina slid a notepad toward me across the desk, and on it she'd written a single line: "Ask her to come here." I sat with the phone against my ear and thought of the education account Lorelei and I had opened the week Layla was born. Funded a little more every year the boats did well. Meant to carry her clean through 4 years of school without either of us ever having to ask Rodrigo or Avery for a dime. Nobody had mentioned that account to me in over a year. I made a note silent to ask about it before the day was through. "Can you meet me?" I asked. "Tomorrow. I'm with a lawyer now, someone who can help both of us." "Tell me where," Layla said, and for the first time in 11 months, her voice sounded less like a girl bracing for another disappointment and more like the granddaughter I remembered, steady under pressure, the way her grandmother had been. "I'll bring everything I've kept, every message, every screenshot, everything I was afraid to show you because I didn't think you'd believe me over him." "I believe you," I said, and meant it more completely than I'd meant almost anything in the last 2 days. "Then I'll see you tomorrow, Grandpa," she said. And I'm bringing all of it. Dr. Maria Collier's office didn't look like a place where a man's independence got decided. It looked like an ordinary exam room with better lighting, a round table instead of a bed, and a shelf of wooden puzzles that made me feel older than any mirror ever had, the way certain rooms designed for the elderly manage to insult you simply by existing. Regina had arranged the appointment herself, calling in a favor from a colleague who used Collier for exactly this kind of dispute, and had driven me there herself that morning with a folder of my own, now thin compared to Rodrigo's, but growing by the hour. "I'm not here to catch you failing," Collier said before she'd asked me a single question, sitting across the table with a legal pad, much like the ones Nola and Regina both kept. "I'm here to document what's actually true, whichever direction that happens to point." She started simple. The date. The county. The reason for my visit, which I gave her plainly, a dispute over my capacity raised by my son-in-law in the course of a property transfer. She asked me to remember 5 words, then spent 10 minutes on other things entirely, asking about my morning, my breakfast, the drive over, before circling back to ask for the words again. I gave her all 5 without hesitating, the way I'd have named the parts of an engine I'd rebuilt 100 times. She had me draw a clock. She had me subtract 7 from 100 over and over until the numbers got small enough that I had to slow down and actually think, which she seemed to expect and didn't count against me. Somewhere around the 4th subtraction, I caught myself gripping the pencil the way I used to grip a wheel in rough water, as if getting this arithmetic wrong might actually cost me the harbor, and I had to remind myself that the test wasn't the danger. The test was simply the only honest thing standing between me and the danger, which made it worth doing carefully. She showed me line drawings of animals I hadn't seen since Layla was small enough to want them read aloud from a picture book, and asked me to name each one. She asked what I would do if I smelled smoke in a crowded room. I told her I'd get people moving toward the exits before I worried about anything else. The same answer I'd have given 40 years ago on any boat I'd ever captained. Then she set her pin down and asked about Rodrigo, and that part was harder than any number had been. "Do you believe your son-in-law wants to harm you?" "I believe he wants my dock lease badly enough to call whatever he's doing necessary," I said. "Do you hate him?" "No." "Do you trust him?" "No." "Can both of those things be true at once?" "They have to be," I said. "He's still my daughter's husband. He's still Layla's father. Hating him clean through would be simpler, but it wouldn't be honest." Collier wrote something down without looking up, and I couldn't tell from her expression whether that answer had helped or hurt whatever picture she was building of me. When the testing ended, she didn't tell me the results outright, only that she'd send a full written report to Regina within the day, and asked almost offhand whether I had lunch plans. I said I didn't. She told me to make some, the kind of instruction that sounded less like small talk and more like a woman quietly signaling that she expected me to still be a free man by the afternoon. Regina was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her car with her phone in hand, and read something on the screen that made her stand up straighter as I approached. "Preliminary numbers came through already," she said. 29 out of 30 on the cognitive assessment. Fully oriented, capable of managing complex financial and legal decisions, experiencing what she called appropriate and proportionate emotional distress given recent events. No indication of any neurocognitive disorder. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time since the festival. A knot I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying since Rodrigo first said the word confused out loud in front of a television camera. "That should end this. It should end the medical half of it," Regina said, more carefully than I wanted her to be in that moment. "It doesn't undo the forged letter, and it doesn't touch the lease transfer directly. But it takes away the one card Rodrigo needed to make any of this look defensible to a judge or a title company. He built his entire case on you being someone this report just proved you aren't." We stood in that parking lot for a moment longer than either of us needed to, sunlight coming off the hoods of parked cars, and for the first time in 2 days, I let myself believe briefly that the worst of it might already be behind me. Regina didn't say anything to discourage that feeling, though. I'd learn later she hadn't shared it. Not fully, not with Rodrigo's warning about who's actually behind this, still sitting unanswered on her legal pad. "Go home and rest," she said. Tomorrow we start building the rest of the case properly. Today, let yourself have this." I did. For a few hours, sitting on Nola's porch with a glass of sweet tea and the tide coming in slow across the flats, I let myself have it completely, not yet knowing how little time that particular kind of peace was going to be allowed to last. I went back to Regina's office the next morning, still carrying some of the previous day's calm, the way you carry warmth from a fire after you've already stepped back outside into the cold. Nola came with me this time, settling into the second client chair with her cane hooked over one knee. And Regina had the Collier report printed and clipped to a folder that was noticeably thicker than it had been 48 hours earlier. "We file the capacity report with the title company today," Regina said, along with Dr. McDaniel's written denial, which came in first thing this morning. "Between the two, I think we have enough to void the certificate outright without ever setting foot in a courtroom." I let myself believe that sentence completely, which is probably why I didn't hear the door at the bottom of the stairs until it had already opened. Alonzo Pineda climbed the narrow staircase alone, no folder tucked under his arm this time, just a single manila envelope held loosely at his side. And something about the ease of his posture told me, before he'd said a word, that he wasn't here to negotiate anything. The window unit rattled its usual complaint behind Regina's desk, and for a moment nobody moved. The three of us, watching him cross the small room the way you'd watch a rising tide. You'd misjudged the timing on, close enough now that outrunning it was no longer an option. "Miss Reese?" he said pleasantly in the exact way that had made my skin crawl in that clinic waiting room 2 days earlier. I apologize for arriving without an appointment. I was told this was where I'd find Mr. Stevenson. Regina stood unhurried, positioning herself slightly between Alonzo and the desk. "This is a private legal consultation." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not here on my own business today." He held the envelope out toward her, not toward me, the gesture of a man who understood exactly which person in the room actually mattered in a moment like this one. "I'm delivering this as a courtesy, since we're going to be seeing quite a bit of each other over the coming weeks." Regina took the envelope without opening it yet, weighing it briefly in her hand the way you'd weigh a fish before deciding whether it was worth cleaning. "And what exactly is this?" "An emergency petition," Alonzo said, "for guardianship and protective placement filed this morning on behalf of Rodrigo French. The hearing's been expedited given the medical concerns raised. Tomorrow morning, county courthouse." The room went very still. Nola's hand tightened on the head of her cane knuckles pale, though her face gave away nothing at all. "On what grounds," I said, "when the capacity evaluation you're standing 3 feet away from proves I don't need one?" Alonzo's smile didn't move. "I haven't seen whatever report you're referring to. I'd imagine the court will want to weigh it against the other evidence Rodrigo's prepared. There's quite a bit of it." He left without waiting to be shown out, his footsteps unhurried on the stairs, the way they'd been unhurried leaving the clinic. A man who'd learned that walking away calmly was itself a kind of threat. Regina opened the envelope at her desk, standing rather than sitting, and I watched her expression change as she read the careful stillness of a woman refusing to let her face give me bad news before her voice had finished forming the words. "He's alleging you're unable to manage your own medication and finances," she said, scanning quickly. "That you wandered away from medical care without authorization, that you're being unduly influenced by, and I'm quoting directly, a woman he met at a hospital who has since relocated him to her private property under circumstances suggesting financial exploitation." "That's me," Nola said flat. "That's you," Regina agreed, still reading. "There are photographs attached. You leaving the hospital in a county transport van, you entering the nursery property, an affidavit from Alonzo himself alleging you falsely represented yourself as Mrs. Fleming's grandson at St. Catherine in order to interfere with her placement." She turned a page. "There are also statements from 2 neighbors on your street describing incidents Rodrigo's attorney has characterized as evidence of decline. One says you left your garage door open overnight last month. Another says they found you searching through a recycling bin because you'd misplaced an envelope." "Both of those things happened," I said. "Neither of them means what he's making them mean." "I know that," Regina said. "A judge meeting you for the first time tomorrow won't, not without context, We'll have less than a day to build." She kept reading. "There's a letter here, too, from the medical director at Driftwood Manor, stating that Rodrigo consulted their staff regarding your, quote, progressive memory impairment, and that supervised placement would significantly reduce risk to your safety." I felt the floor of the morning's calm give way entirely beneath me. That was 90 seconds to stop a man from bullying a 93-year-old woman into signing paperwork she didn't want to sign. "I understand that," Regina said. "A judge tomorrow may not have the context to understand it quite as quickly." She turned another page, and something in her posture changed, her shoulders dropping half an inch, the particular stillness of a person finding the worst part of a document after already believing they'd found it. "What?" I said. "What else is in there?" Regina looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I heard something close to genuine reluctance in her voice before she answered. "There's a video file attached," she said, "from your colonoscopy last year. I need you to see it before tomorrow morning, and I need you to prepare yourself because I don't think it's going to look the way you remember that day." Regina turned her laptop so the three of us could see the screen together, and pressed play before any of us had said we were ready. The video opened in a recovery room I recognized immediately. Pale curtains, a rolling tray, the particular fluorescent hum of a place designed to keep people comfortable without ever quite succeeding. I was in the bed, propped up at an angle, my eyes half open in a way that made my stomach drop the moment I saw it. Because I remembered almost nothing of the actual morning this had been recorded, only the vague, cottony feeling of surfacing slowly from anesthesia, the way a diver surfaces from deep water too fast to be safe and too slow to feel controlled. Rodrigo's voice came from behind the phone, close and steady. "Dad, what month is it?" On screen, I mumbled something that might have been March, though the timestamp in the corner read September clearly enough for anyone watching to catch the discrepancy. "Where do you live?" I gave an address on screen that wasn't the guest cottage, wasn't even Harbor Point, but a house Lorelei and I had sold nearly 20 years earlier, the kind of old information that surfaces first and stays longest when the newer layers get temporarily washed away by sedation. "Who's the mayor of this town?" I said a name I didn't recognize even now watching it happen, and Rodrigo's voice made a small sound of acknowledgement, neither correcting me nor moving on, simply letting the wrong answer sit there on camera a beat longer than it needed to. Then the video ended abrupt cut clean at what the timestamp showed as 41 seconds mid-sentence before whatever came next in that recovery room had a chance to complicate the picture Rodrigo was building. Nobody spoke right away. I sat looking at my own frozen face on Regina's screen, slack-jawed, confused a version of myself I didn't recognize and couldn't argue with because some version of that morning had genuinely happened, even if I couldn't remember it happening quite that way. "That's not," I started and found I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I don't remember any of that." "You wouldn't," Regina said gently. "The anesthesia records from that procedure would show you'd received sedation less than 90 minutes before this was filmed. Any competent attorney would argue you were legally incapable of providing informed responses to anything during that window, let alone demonstrating baseline cognitive function." She paused. "That argument requires the anesthesia records, which we don't currently have." "Get them," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "I will. Today, if the surgical center's records department will move that fast, which is not guaranteed on short notice." She closed the laptop slowly, as though closing it any faster might somehow make the footage more permanent than it already was. "Arthur, I have to be honest with you about what we're facing. Between this video and the petition Alonso delivered this morning, Rodrigo's built something that looks on its surface considerably more convincing than 3 days ago I would have guessed he was capable of." Nola hadn't said a word since the video started. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual dry edge entirely. "When is the hearing?" Regina checked the notice again, though I suspected she already knew the answer and was only confirming it aloud because saying it once herself might make it easier to say to us. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock County Courthouse emergency docket. That's less than 24 hours from right now." 24 hours. I thought of the 9 days I'd been counting since the closing disclosure first arrived. The number that had felt, even at its worst, like something a man could still work with. 24 hours wasn't a number you worked with. It was a number that worked on you. "What happens at the hearing," I asked, "if we don't have the anesthesia records by then?" Regina didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me more than whatever she eventually said. A judge could grant temporary emergency guardianship pending a fuller review. It wouldn't be permanent. It also wouldn't be nothing. It could mean a court-appointed guardian controlling your finances, your medical decisions, possibly your living arrangements until a later hearing sorts out what's actually true. "They could put me in that facility," I said. "Driftwood." "They could recommend it," Regina said. "I would fight that specific placement with everything available to me, but yes, that's the realistic range of what tomorrow could produce if we walk in with what we currently have." I looked down at my own hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been at the festival 2 days earlier, and found I couldn't reconcile them with the trembling, confused hands on the screen Regina had just closed. Both belonged to me. Only one of them was true. I thought of every morning I'd counted that bell alone, certain that solitude was the same thing as strength, that a man who needed nobody's help could never be made to look the way I'd just looked on that screen. I had been wrong about that in a way I was only now beginning to understand. Alone was exactly how a man ended up recorded at his most unguarded, with nobody in the room who loved him enough to say on camera that the footage wasn't the whole truth. The window unit rattled on behind us indifferent, and somewhere below on Market Street, a delivery truck backed up with its warning beeper sounding 3 short notes over and over. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon continuing, outside a room where nothing about my life felt ordinary anymore. Nobody said anything else for a long time. Regina sat with her hands folded on the closed laptop. Nola stared at the window unit as though it had personally offended her. I sat between them with my own hands in my lap, watching a slice of afternoon light move slowly across the water-stained ceiling tile, and let the silence stretch out exactly as long as it needed to, because there was nothing left to say that would make 24 hours feel like enough time, and every one of us in that small office already knew it. The anesthesia records arrived at 11 that night, faxed over by a records clerk Regina had apparently charmed, bullied, or both into working past her shift. They confirmed everything we already knew to be true, and none of it mattered quite the way we'd hoped. The judge at the emergency hearing the next morning read them carefully, asked Regina and Rodrigo's attorney a handful of pointed questions, and ultimately split the difference the way emergency dockets often do when nobody involved has had enough time to prove anything completely. She declined to grant Rodrigo guardianship outright. She also declined to dismiss the petition, citing the disputed capacity certificate, the disputed transfers, and what she called, without much warmth in her voice, competing and largely unverified claims from every direction. In their place, she appointed a neutral, temporary operations monitor for 10 days, someone from the State Harbor Authority, with no relationship to either side, to oversee the lease and freeze any further transfers until a fuller hearing could be scheduled. I was allowed to keep living wherever I chose. I could not access the frozen accounts, could not alter the lease, could not make any binding decision about Harbor Point without the monitor's approval. Regina called it a partial victory on the courthouse steps. I heard only the part where I was for the next 10 days. At minimum, no longer the person legally in charge of a dock I'd run for 44 years. There was a particular kind of grief in that sentence I hadn't expected. I had spent my whole working life believing that control held tightly enough and alone enough was the one thing that couldn't be taken from a man who simply refused to let go of it. Sitting in that courtroom, I'd learned otherwise. Control could be signed away by strangers who'd never once stood on my dock, based on 41 seconds of a morning I couldn't even remember living. Nola drove us back to the house in near silence, and I spent most of the ride staring out at marsh grass bending in a wind I couldn't feel through the closed window, thinking about how thoroughly a single video 41 seconds long had managed to outweigh 61 years of showing up. Layla was waiting on Nola's porch when we arrived, her own laptop open on her knees, and she didn't look up right away. too absorbed in whatever was on the screen to register the sound of the car. "How bad?" she asked once we'd climbed the steps, still not looking up. 10 days under a monitor, I said. Not guardianship. Not yet. Not yet, she repeated, and something in her voice had gone flat and determined in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was small enough to insist on tying her own shoelaces, refusing help even when her hands weren't quite ready for the task. "I logged into the shared cloud folder this morning, the one I told you about." She turned the laptop toward me. Rows of file names filled the screen. Invoices, scanned receipts, a handful of photographs, the ordinary detritus of a small business's digital paperwork accumulated over several years without much organization behind it. "Most of it's nothing," she said. "But I started sorting by date instead of name, and I found this." She clicked a file. A scanned document opened the same succession certificate Nola and I had already seen at the recorder's office, the one bearing Fernando McDaniel's forged signature. Beneath it, in the document's metadata panel, Layla had pulled up alongside the scan, sat a line I read twice before I understood what I was looking at. "Digitally verified by L French Coastal Notary Access Portal." "That's your name," I said. "That's my login," Layla said, and her voice had lost its determined flatness entirely, now replaced by something closer to the frightened 24-year-old I'd spoken to on the phone 2 days earlier. "I had notary training 2 summers ago for a job I never actually took. I never used the credential. I don't understand how it's attached to a document I've never seen, verifying a signature I know for a fact is forged." I looked at the screen at my granddaughter's name sitting beside a crime neither of us had committed, and felt the ground shift again, in a direction I hadn't braced for. "Layla," I said carefully, "did you ever share that login with anyone? Your mother, maybe, to notarize something small, a favor?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her own name on the screen, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "I don't remember doing that," she said. "But I don't remember a lot of things clearly from that summer. I was between semesters. Mom asked me for a lot of passwords that year, said she was helping me organize my accounts before school started." Her hands had gone still on the keyboard. Not one that would have made either of us feel better in that moment, and so I did the only thing that felt honest. I sat down beside her on the porch steps, put my hand over hers on the laptop's edge, and let the two of us look at that damning line of text together, neither of us alone with it anymore. "We'll figure out how it got there," I said. "Together. Not you sorting through this by yourself on a porch at midnight, and not me pretending I can carry it alone either." Layla looked over at me, something loosening slightly in her shoulders for the first time since we'd sat down. "That's new," she said. "You saying together?" "It's new," I agreed. "I'm told it's supposed to be an improvement." We stayed on that porch past midnight, Layla's laptop balanced between us, working through the shared folder, file by file, the way Nola had taught me to work through public records 2 days earlier. Patiently, without assuming any single document told the whole story on its own. Layla sorted by creation date instead of file name, the same trick that had led her to the succession certificate hours before, and we worked backward through nearly 3 years of scanned paperwork, most of it unremarkable, some of it simply sad in the way old invoices always are, evidence of a struggling business trying to look steadier on paper than it had ever actually been. The notary credential led us somewhere Layla hadn't expected. Beneath the metadata for the forged succession certificate sat a secondary log one most people would never think to open, recording every account that had accessed or modified the file since its creation. Layla's login appeared once passively the way a credential appears when it's borrowed rather than used. A second name appeared 4 separate times across 4 separate documents, actively, deliberately, each instance time-stamped and stamped with an official notary seal number. A French Florida Commission Notary Seal Number 118-4402. "That's Aunt Abigail," Layla said quietly. "Rodrigo's sister. She's done our family's notary work for years. Wills, powers of attorney, the paperwork for Dad's business loans. Nobody thought anything of it because she's family, and family doing the paperwork always feels like a kindness instead of a risk." We opened each of the 4 documents her seal appeared on. Two were legitimate, ordinary business filings from years earlier, nothing sinister in them at all. The third was the succession certificate itself. The fourth, dated only 3 days before the festival, was a document neither of us had seen yet, titled simply Voluntary Operational Acknowledgement, bearing my signature at the bottom, and Abigail's notary seal beside it, certifying that she had personally witnessed me sign the document in her presence. I hadn't signed anything in Abigail French's presence in over a year. "Check the creation time," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Compare it against where I actually was that day." Layla pulled up the file properties, and I watched her expression change as the numbers resolved into something neither of us could argue with. The document had been created blank at 7:14 that morning, hours before the festival even began. The signed notarized version, the one bearing my forged signature and Abigail's certification that she'd watched me sign it, had been saved at 2:41 that same afternoon. "That's the day of the festival," I said slowly, working through it. 2:41 in the afternoon. Where were you at 2:41? I thought back, counting the hours the way I'd once counted tide tables methodically, unwilling to trust memory alone when arithmetic could confirm it. At the cardiology clinic, waiting room, then the exam room with Dr. McDaniel himself going over my discharge instructions from the procedure. I have the appointment confirmation on my phone, still time-stamped. "So you couldn't have been in a notary's office signing anything at the same time?" "No," I said. I was sitting across from the one man whose signature they'd forged 6 miles from wherever Abigail's seal actually was, being told not to drive for another week. He was renewing my prescription while somebody else was using his name to sign away my doc. Layla sat back against the porch railing, the laptop's glow catching the exhaustion under her eyes. "She didn't make one mistake, Grandpa. She's been doing this for years, quietly, on documents nobody ever double-checked because they trusted her precisely because she was family. And now she's certifying signatures for a moment that provably never happened." I looked out at the dark marsh beyond the porch light, frogs working themselves into their nighttime chorus along the creek bank, and felt the full shape of what we'd found settle over me slowly, the way cold water fills a boot from the ankle up rather than all at once. This wasn't Rodrigo alone improvising under pressure the week his company needed cash. This was a structure built by at least 2 people over a period of years, each document a small, deliberate brick laid long before I'd ever stood on that festival platform and heard my own retirement announced to a television camera. Abigail hadn't forged one signature in a moment of panic. She'd built a practiced system for making lies look notarized, tested it quietly on smaller matters first, and only turned it against me once the stakes were large enough to justify the risk. I thought of Abigail at Layla's high school graduation 5 years back, the way she'd cried harder than anyone in the family when Layla walked across that stage. The way she'd hugged me afterward and said she was proud to watch this family do something right for once. I had believed her completely. I still couldn't decide, sitting on that porch, whether the woman who'd cried at that graduation and the woman whose seal appeared on 4 fraudulent documents were the same person wearing 2 different faces, or whether one of those women had simply been waiting the whole time for the other to be useful. "We need to show this to Regina first thing tomorrow," I said. "Every document, every timestamp." "And then what happens to Aunt Abigail?" I didn't have a gentle answer for that. And I'd learned enough in the last 3 days not to pretend I did. "Then the same thing that's happening to your father," I said. "The truth stops being something the family gets to manage privately and starts being something a court decides." Layla nodded slowly, closed the laptop, and for a long moment neither of us said anything else. Both of us sitting with the particular weight of understanding that the people who'd betrayed me hadn't done it once, carelessly, in a moment of weakness. They'd done it for years, carefully, and called it family the whole time. 2 evenings after we handed everything to Regina, I found myself alone in Nola's net shed, a low wooden building behind the guest cottage that smelled of tar and brine and the particular mustiness of rope that had been wet and dried 1,000 times over. Nola had offered it to me almost as an afterthought, mentioning that her late husband's old net-mending tools were still in there if I wanted somewhere quiet to sit that wasn't a porch or a lawyer's office. I hadn't expected to need it quite this badly. The evening had gone the way most of them had gone that week, full of phone calls and waiting Regina promising to file the notary evidence first thing in the morning. The 10-day monitor still standing between me and my own dock. Rodrigo's silence somehow louder than his threats had been. I'd reached a point where sitting still in a room with nobody needing anything from me felt like the only genuinely restful thing left available to me. And so I'd walked out to the shed with no real purpose beyond wanting 4 walls that didn't contain a phone. A tangle of old net hung from a hook near the workbench, half repaired and abandoned mid-project years earlier by the look of the dust on it. The kind of unfinished task that outlives the person who started it. I picked it up without thinking, meaning to clear it off the hook and out of the way, and found my hands going still around the knotted mesh instead. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even Nola's, not really. More likely her husband's, some repair he'd never gotten back to before he died. And yet holding it, feeling the particular give and resistance of old cord between my fingers, I thought of my own net shed, sitting empty back at Harbor Point. The basket of Lorelei's mending supplies I hadn't touched in 4 years, sitting exactly where she'd left them, because moving them had always felt like erasing something I wasn't ready to erase. I nearly threw the tangled net into the trash bin by the door. My hand was actually over the lid before something in me refused the motion, some old instinct that had kept me from throwing away perfectly repairable gear my whole working life. Some things left unfinished by someone else weren't yours to discard. I set it back on the hook instead, and it was in reaching up to rehang it properly that my fingers found the edge of an old tin box wedged behind the workbench's top shelf. The kind of hiding place a person chooses specifically because nobody goes looking for anything back there. Nola's late husband, maybe. Or maybe, and I felt something in my chest tighten at the thought, somewhere a woman who'd spent her last months arranging things carefully might have asked a favor of a friend before she got too sick to arrange much of anything herself. I opened the tin with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside sat a single envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, my name written across the front in handwriting I would have known anywhere on earth. Arthur, if the doc ever becomes an argument. Lorelei had rarely put serious things in writing. She preferred to say them aloud, face to face, where she could watch whether they'd landed the way she intended. Seeing my full name written out like this, unhurried and deliberate, instead of dashed off on a grocery list, told me before I'd read a single line that whatever came next, she'd meant it to outlast her. I sat down on the shed's single stool and broke the seal carefully. The paper inside soft with age, but the ink still dark. She must have left this with Nola sometime in those last months back when the two of them had apparently known each other far better than I'd ever realized. 2 women quietly making arrangements for a future neither of them expected me to navigate gracefully on my own. Arthur, the letter began. If you're reading this, someone has decided the dock is worth more as an argument than as a home. I want you to know something before you go any further into whatever fight that's become. This harbor is yours for as long as you want it. Don't hold on to it because you think grief requires it, and don't let go of it because someone makes you feel guilty for keeping what's rightfully yours. Those are 2 different mistakes, and I've watched you circle both of them your whole life. If Rodrigo is the one making this an argument, I want him to understand something too, though. I doubt you'll show him this until long after he deserves to read it. An inheritance is what remains after a life has actually been lived, Rodrigo. It is not a debt owed to you in advance. Your father-in-law's steadiness is not an obstacle standing between you and your future. It was always meant to be part of what we hoped you'd learn to have yourself. Help given freely is love. Help demanded through fear is only ever control wearing love's clothes. Teach the difference to anyone who still needs learning it before you lose them to the confusion between the two. I folded the letter along its original crease when I finished, my hands steadier now than they'd been opening it, and sat for a long while in the dark shed with only the tin box and the old unfinished net for company. Somewhere beyond the walls, the creek kept working against the pilings the way it had every night since I'd arrived, patient and indifferent, the way water always is toward whatever grief happens to be sitting nearby. Regina called before 8 the next morning, her voice carrying the particular briskness of someone who'd already been awake and working for hours. "Come in this morning if you can." The surgical center's cloud provider finally responded to the preservation notice I sent the day after the guardianship petition arrived. "We have the complete recording now, not the 41 seconds Rodrigo submitted to the court." I drove myself to Market Street for the first time since the festival and found something almost steadying in the ordinary act of gripping a wheel again, of being trusted, at least by myself, to get somewhere on my own. Regina had her laptop open and ready when I arrived, Nola already seated beside her with her cane across her knees. "I want to prepare you," Regina said before starting the file. "The edited version was bad. This is worse, in a different way. I need you to watch the whole thing before we talk about what it means." She pressed play. The recovery room looked the same as it had in the version I'd already seen. Pale curtains, the rolling tray, my own half-lidded eyes, staring at nothing in particular. But this time, the video kept running past the 41-second mark, past the moment where Rodrigo's edited clip had ended clean and convenient. "What month is it, Dad?" I mumbled March again, same as before. "Where do you live?" The old address again, the house Lorelei and I had sold 20 years back. But then off camera, a second voice cut in, younger, sharper-edged, with something close to alarm. "Dad, stop! He's still under anesthesia. He can't actually answer that." "I'm just checking how he's tracking," Rodrigo said, unbothered, his voice moving slightly as though he'd turned partway toward whoever had spoken. "This is exactly the kind of thing the doctor at Driftwood asked me to document. He's not tracking anything right now because you gave him something to make him sleep through a camera going up his intestine," the younger voice said. "This isn't documentation. This is you filming him at his worst on purpose." I knew that voice before. Regina paused the video to let me catch my breath. Layla. 23 years old at the time, judging by how she'd have aged into the young woman I'd spoken to on the phone 2 nights earlier, standing somewhere just out of frame in that recovery room, already fighting a battle on my behalf that I hadn't known was being fought. "She was there," I said, my voice not entirely steady. "She tried to stop him." I thought of the 11 months I'd spent believing Layla had stolen from me, had disappeared out of guilt or indifference, when the truth was she'd been standing in a recovery room fighting to protect me from her own father, while I lay there unable to even know I needed protecting. I had let Rodrigo's version of her stand unchallenged for nearly a year, simply because it had arrived first and I hadn't thought to ask for a second one. "She did," Regina said, and Rodrigo edited her voice out entirely before submitting the clip to the court, along with the 5 minutes and 19 seconds of footage that came after it, which is where things get considerably more damning for him. The video continued. Rodrigo asked the same questions 3 more times, patient in a way that had nothing gentle in it, pressing until my drugged answers began to blur into something that might, out of context, resemble consent to whatever he asked next. At one point, he asked plainly whether I wanted him to take care of the harbor lease for me. I mumbled something unintelligible. He asked again. I said something closer to take care of it. Off camera, Layla's voice rose, telling him that wasn't consent, that I was sedated, that he needed to stop recording immediately, or she'd tell her mother what he was doing. The video ended not because Rodrigo chose to stop, but because Layla had apparently taken the phone from his hand herself the final few seconds, tilting wildly toward the ceiling before cutting to black. Nobody spoke for a moment after the screen went dark. The anesthesia record shows you received sedation less than 90 minutes before this recording began, Regina said finally. Combined with Layla's audible objections, combined with Rodrigo's own question about the lease phrased exactly the way a man phrases something he intends to use later, this isn't just unhelpful to his position anymore. It actively undermines it. A judge watching the full 6 minutes sees a son-in-law manufacturing consent from a sedated, non-consenting patient over his own daughter's explicit objection. Can we use this? We can subpoena the original file directly from the cloud account, rather than relying on what Rodrigo chooses to hand over voluntarily, which we've now done. Regina said. Between this, the forensic timeline on Abigail's notary seal, Dr. McDaniel's written denial, and Layla's testimony about the shared credential, I believe we have enough to request a full evidentiary hearing rather than continuing to fight this piecemeal through emergency motions. Nola leaned forward slightly. How soon? I'll file the request today, Regina said. Given the severity of what's now on record, I'd expect the court to move quickly. We should have a hearing date within the week. She closed the laptop, the small click of the latch loud in the sudden quiet of the office. This is no longer a dispute about whether your father might be confused, Arthur. It's a documented pattern, and patterns are considerably harder for a courtroom to look past than a single bad morning. Nola's case reached a probate judge 3 days before mine was scheduled to reach anyone at all. A small mercy of court calendars that meant I sat in the gallery of that courtroom as a spectator for once. Layla beside me, both of us there to watch someone else's 14 months of fighting finally arrive at an ending. The courtroom was smaller than the one where my own emergency hearing had taken place, wood-paneled, with a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead that did little against the closeness of the room. Alonzo sat at the petitioner's table in a suit that fit him the way all his suits seemed to, a size more expensive than the occasion strictly required. Nola sat beside her own attorney, spine straight, cane resting against her chair, refusing the offered glass of water with a small shake of her head that suggested she considered thirst a weakness she hadn't yet decided to develop. Her physician testified first, description arthritis, some hearing loss, occasional difficulty recalling names, conditions any 93-year-old might reasonably carry, and none of them, in his professional opinion, rising anywhere near a level that impaired her capacity to manage her own affairs or her own land. Then a forensic document examiner took the stand, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and walked the court through what he'd found when he'd analyzed the land option Alonzo claimed Nola had willingly signed the previous spring. The document, he explained, had been assembled from 2 separate scans, stitched together. The first page, an innocuous soil survey authorization Nola had genuinely approved. The remaining pages, an option granting a developer the right to purchase her eastern acreage at less than half its appraised value, printed on paper with a subtly different watermark than the first page carried. An assistant may have attached the wrong page by accident, Alonzo's attorney offered when his turn came. 4 times, the examiner said, identically across 4 separate copies distributed to 4 separate parties would be an unusually consistent accident. Then I testified briefly about the clinic waiting room, about Alonzo's folder with Driftwood Manor's photograph on the front, about the way he'd called Nola, confused in a public room, the moment she'd refused to sign something she clearly understood perfectly well. Alonzo's attorney asked why a stranger had felt entitled to intervene in a family medical decision. Because I recognized what I was watching, I said. I'd just lived a version of it myself 3 hours earlier, at a festival with a television camera instead of a waiting room. Nola testified last, and if 14 months of fighting had worn her down, she didn't let the courtroom see it. She described Alonzo's visits growing more frequent in the weeks after a developer's $3.2 million offer on her eastern field described the confusion. He began cataloging afterward, described power of attorney documents that had somehow reverted to granting him authority twice, despite her signing revocations both times. "Are you confused, Mrs. Fleming?" his attorney asked her directly, the kind of question meant to provoke exactly the rattled response that would prove his point. "Every single day in small ways," Nola said, unhurried. "I walked into my own pantry last Tuesday and stood there for a full minute before I remembered what I'd gone in for. I also remember every parcel line on Harbor Road and precisely which trust holds title to Mr. Stevenson's dock should anyone care to ask me under oath. Human beings are neither perfectly sharp nor entirely lost, sir. That distinction is simply inconvenient for people hoping to profit from pretending otherwise." The judge took 20 minutes to decide. When she returned, she denied the guardianship petition outright, upheld Nola's revocation of Alonzo's power of attorney, ordered him to return all business and financial records in his possession, and referred the altered land option document to the state attorney's office for investigation, along with the question of how Alonzo had twice regained access to a medical portal Nola had specifically locked him out of. Alonzo approached her once more outside the courtroom, his composure finally cracking at the edges. "You've destroyed the only family you had left," he said. Nola said, standing very straight despite the cane. "I stopped you from selling what was never yours to sell. If the only relationship you offered me required my obedience, I lost nothing today that was ever truly mine to keep." He looked at me then, the way a man looks at an inconvenience he hasn't finished accounting for. "Enjoy whatever you think you're getting out of this," he said, and walked away without waiting for an answer, already dialing someone on his phone before he'd reached the elevator. I watched him go, and felt something unexpected settle over me, not quite triumph, closer to recognition. Nola's fight and mine had run on parallel tracks for days now, two old people accused of the same convenient confusion by men who profited from being believed over us, and watching her win hers gave me the first evidence I'd had that a courtroom could actually see through a folder full of official-looking paper when someone stood there long enough, patiently enough, refusing to perform the fragility being demanded of them. Layla had drifted a few steps down the hallway while we waited, and when I found her again, she was standing very still beside a bulletin board near the clerk's window, staring at a printed page she must have picked up from the public filing counter, her face gone the color of old paper. "Layla," she turned the page toward me without a word, one name circled in pencil among a list of minority shareholders, a name that had no obvious business appearing anywhere near Gulf Tide Holdings at all, and one I recognized immediately, because it belonged to the young man my granddaughter had been quietly engaged to for the better part of a year. Layla didn't say much on the drive back to Nola's. The printed shareholder page folded into a tight square in her lap, and I didn't push her to. Some silences need room to finish becoming whatever they're going to become before a person can talk through them out loud. She waited until we were in Nola's kitchen, the three of us around the table with the evening settling gray outside the window, before she finally smoothed the page flat and read the line aloud herself, as though hearing it in her own voice might make it more real. Or less real. She didn't seem certain which. Coastal Vista Development Partners, minority stake Gulf Tide Holdings. Filed the same week the company was formed, she looked up. That's Nico's family's company. His father and his uncle run it. He's worked there since he graduated. You didn't know, I said, not quite a question. I didn't know about this. She turned her phone over in her hands twice before setting it on the table, screen up as though daring herself to reach for it. I need to call him. I need to hear it from him directly, and I need someone else in the room when I do, because I don't trust myself not to talk myself out of what I already know I saw. Nola pushed the phone an inch closer to her without a word. Layla dialed and set it on speaker between us. Nico answered on the second ring, his voice warm in the easy, unguarded way of a man who had no idea yet what kind of call this was. "Hey, I was just about to text you. How'd the hearing go for Mrs. Fleming?" "She won," Layla said. "Nico, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it instead of asking me why I'm asking." A pause longer than the question should have required. "Okay. Does your family's company hold a stake in something called Gulf Tide Holdings?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that I watched Layla's hand tighten around the edge of the table, her knuckles going the same pale I'd seen on Nola's earlier that day. "Layla, yes or no, Nico?" "Yes," he said, quieter now, whatever warmth had been in his voice at the start of the call entirely gone. "A minority stake. My dad and my uncle put money into it early, before I even knew the name meant anything connected to you. By the time I found out what Gulf Tide was actually doing with your grandfather's lease, it was already moving, and I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I'd known from the beginning and let it happen anyway." "Did you know from the beginning?" "No. I swear to you, no. I found out weeks after the investment was already made, when my uncle mentioned the Harbor Point property in passing like it was just another line item." His voice cracked slightly. I should have told you the second I understood what it meant. I kept telling myself I'd say something once I had more information, once I understood exactly how deep my family's involvement went, and every day I didn't say it made the next day harder to start. That's not an excuse, that's a description of a decision you kept making over and over every single day. I know that, he said. I'm not asking you to forgive it right now. I'm telling you the truth because you asked me directly, and because I'd rather lose you honestly than keep you by staying quiet. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, rougher. I've watched what my family calls business for years, without asking too many questions about where the money actually comes from. I told myself that was normal, that everyone's family has arrangements they don't examine too closely. I didn't let myself examine this one either, until it had your grandfather's name attached to it, and by then, examining it meant admitting I'd been comfortable not looking for a long time. Layla closed her eyes. I watched something move across her face that I recognized immediately because I'd worn the same expression myself more than once in the last week. The particular exhaustion of a person calculating exactly how much more betrayal they could absorb from people who were supposed to have been safe. I need time, she said finally. I can't be objective about this in the next 5 minutes, and I have a hearing in 2 days that matters more than either of us right now. I understand, Nico said. Whatever you need, I mean that. She ended the call without saying goodbye, set the phone face down on the table, and sat very still for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, the way I had a habit of doing myself when a piece of ground I'd trusted turned out not to hold weight the way I'd assumed it would. She didn't say out loud that some small, frightened part of her was already calculating whether telling Regina about Nico's family might cost her him entirely, the way telling the truth about the pawned ring 2 years earlier had cost her nearly a year of her grandfather's trust. She didn't have to say it. I recognized the particular stillness of a person deciding in real time whether honesty was worth the price it kept demanding of her. Because I'd spent the better part of a week learning that lesson myself, one betrayal at a time. You don't have to decide about him tonight, I said. You only have to decide what Regina needs to know before the hearing. Those are 2 separate questions, even if they don't feel like it right now. Layla nodded slowly, though I couldn't tell watching her whether the nod meant she believed me or simply meant she was too tired to argue. The Franklin County Port Authority meeting room had never, in my 44 years of attending the occasional public session there, held this many people at once. Fishermen filled the folding chairs and lined the back wall, Ray Delgado among them, arms crossed, the same way he'd stood along the seawall the morning Rodrigo's sign went up. Nola sat in the front row, with Layla beside her. Regina sat at the petitioner's table with a stack of folders taller than anything Rodrigo had ever carried onto a festival platform. Rodrigo sat across the aisle with his own attorney, in the same Navy suit he'd worn to the emergency hearing, and Avery sat 1 seat over from him, close enough to suggest solidarity, far enough that I couldn't tell anymore which side of this room she actually belonged to. The board chair, a heavy-set man named Wexler, who'd approved dock permits in this county for over a decade, called the session to order and reminded the gallery that this was a hearing on the disputed lease transfer, not a public forum, though, judging by the density of the crowd, half of Harbor Point intended to treat it as both. Regina rose first. This board granted temporary emergency protections 9 days ago, pending further investigation into the certificate of successor operator filed against Mr. Stevenson's lease. That investigation is now complete, and I'd like to walk the board through what it found. She began with the succession certificate itself, projecting the scanned document onto the screen at the front of the room, the same one Nola and I had first found at the recorder's office. She walked through the physician's letter attached to it, then played the recorded statement Dr. McDaniel had provided the week before, his voice filling the meeting room flat and furious in a way I hadn't heard from him in 11 years of appointments. I did not write, sign, or authorize any statement regarding Arthur Stevenson's cognitive capacity. The signature attributed to me on this document is not mine. A murmur moved through the gallery. Rodrigo stared straight ahead at the screen, his jaw set the way it had been at the dock the morning I'd confronted him, though something in his posture had gone rigid in a way it hadn't been that day. Regina moved next to the notary evidence, the metadata log Layla had found, the 4 documents bearing Abigail French's seal, the timestamp on the voluntary acknowledgement that placed its creation squarely within the window I'd spent sitting in Dr. McDaniel's own exam room, 66 miles by the county's own GPS records, from wherever Abigail's notary equipment had actually been used that afternoon. An assistant may have made an error. Rodrigo's attorney offered the same defense that had failed Alonzo 3 days earlier. 4 times, Regina said, on 4 separate documents spanning 11 weeks is not an assistant's error. It's a pattern, and patterns are what this board is here to evaluate. Then she called me to speak, and I stood at the small podium the board had set up for public testimony, facing a room full of people who'd known me most of my working life. My legs held the way they'd held on every deck I'd ever worked, though my hands found the podium's edge and gripped it the way a man grips a rail in weather he isn't entirely sure of yet. I thought briefly of every morning I'd stood at that bell alone, certain that solitude was strength, and understood that this room, full of people who'd come to hear the truth stated plainly, was the opposite lesson, arriving 9 days too late to spare me the hardest parts of learning it. I told them what had actually happened, without softening any of it for anyone's comfort. I told them about the festival, about Rodrigo announcing my retirement to a television camera before I had heard a word of it myself, about the $11,000 withdrawal from Avery still unexplained, about the forged medical letter, the notary trail, the video from my colonoscopy edited down to 41 seconds to make me look like a man who couldn't be trusted with his own harbor. I told them about Layla's voice on the uncut recording, telling her father to stop, and about the 11 months I'd spent believing the wrong version of my own granddaughter because a lie had simply arrived before the truth did. I've captained a boat and run this dock for over 4 decades, I said, and I know the difference between a line that parts because the weather earned it and a line that's been cut somewhere nobody thought to look. What happened to me wasn't weather anybody stumbled into. It was cut 1 document at a time by people who understood exactly what they were cutting and chose to cut it anyway. I looked at Rodrigo when I said that last part, and for the first time since the festival, he didn't hold my gaze. He looked down at the table instead, at his own hands, and I watched something in his face that I hadn't seen there in 18 years. Not confidence, not calculation, something closer to a man realizing the room had stopped being willing to give him the benefit of any doubt at all. Wexler thanked me and called a 15-minute recess before the board would hear from Rodrigo directly. And as I stepped down from the podium, Ray Delgado caught my eye from the back row and gave a single small nod. The kind of gesture that meant more to me in that moment than anything Regina's folders could have argued on my behalf. When the board reconvened, Wexler called Rodrigo forward to respond to the evidence, but Regina rose first, asking permission to play one final piece of video before testimony began. Wexler granted it, and the meeting room's lights dimmed as the same recovery room footage filled the screen at the front, larger now than it had ever been on Regina's laptop. Every face in that packed room able to see exactly what I'd seen days earlier. The edited 41 seconds played first the version Rodrigo had originally submitted, clean and convenient ending mid-sentence the way it always had. Then Regina let the full 6 minutes run, and the room heard what I had heard Layla's voice cutting in from off-camera, sharp and young and furious. He's not tracking anything right now because you gave him something to make him sleep through a camera going up his intestine. This isn't documentation. This is you filming him at his worst on purpose. Somewhere behind me, I heard Avery make a small, involuntary sound, and when I glanced back, I saw her hand pressed against her mouth, staring at the screen as though she was hearing her daughter's voice from that recovery room for the first time herself. Ray Delgado's arms had uncrossed at some point without my noticing, his hands resting flat on his knees instead, the posture of a man who'd stopped watching this as someone else's family trouble and started watching it as something closer to a verdict on a neighbor he'd trusted his whole life. The video continued through Rodrigo's repeated questions through my drugged mumbling that eventually softened into something that might out of context resemble agreement through Layla's voice rising again telling him to stop recording, that this wasn't consent, that she'd tell her mother what he was doing. The final seconds tilted wildly toward the ceiling before cutting to black, the unmistakable sound of a phone changing hands. Nobody in that packed meeting room said a word when the lights came back up. Wexler cleared his throat twice before he managed to speak. "Mr. French, the board would like you to explain the discrepancy between the footage you submitted and the footage just shown." Rodrigo stood slowly buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture that looked less like confidence now and more like a man buying himself 3 extra seconds to think of something to say. The full recording included context that wasn't relevant to the medical concerns I was documenting. Your daughter explicitly stating that your father-in-law couldn't legally consent to anything you were asking him, Regina said, strikes this board as considerably more relevant than what you chose to submit, not less. Would you agree? I was trying to protect him. By recording him sedated against his daughter's explicit objection and then removing her objection before presenting the footage as evidence of his incompetence, that's not... Rodrigo started, then stopped himself, visibly recalculating. That's not how I would characterize it. How would you characterize it? He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that a few of the fishermen in the back row shifted audibly in their folding chairs. I was under a lot of pressure, he finally said. My company had obligations coming due. I thought if I could show a doctor and a judge that my father-in-law needed help managing things, everyone would end up better off, including him. Including him? Regina repeated, letting the phrase sit in the air a moment before continuing. Did you ask him whether he wanted that kind of help? I tried. He always says no. He said no to help for years, even when he clearly needed it. So when he said no, Regina said, you decided his answer didn't count and built a legal structure to override it instead. Rodrigo's attorney started to object, but Wexler waved it off. This is a hearing counselor, not a jury trial. I'd like to hear the answer myself. Rodrigo looked at the table at his own hands, at anything except the gallery full of fishermen who'd known me since before he'd married into this family. I don't know how to answer that in a way that's going to sound like what I actually meant. Try, Wexler said, not unkindly, though there was nothing soft in his tone either. I needed documentation, Rodrigo said, and I didn't think the full 6 minutes helped my case, so I used the part that did. You mean you needed evidence? Regina said. And when the evidence you gathered contradicted the story you needed it to tell, you edited the evidence instead of abandoning the story? Rodrigo didn't answer that at all. He stood there at the respondents' table, with his jaw working silently, the same posture I'd watched Avery hold in the courtroom gallery all morning. A person calculating exactly how much further this particular hole went before admitting they'd already fallen all the way to the bottom of it. Wexler made a note unhurried and looked up at Rodrigo over the rim of his glasses. The board will take a short recess to review what's been presented. When we return, Mr. French, you'll have the opportunity to respond to the remaining evidence regarding the notary filings and the disputed capacity certificate. I'd encourage you to use the recess to think carefully about how you intend to do that. The gavel came down once sharp in the sudden quiet, and Rodrigo sat back down beside his attorney, without meeting anyone's eyes, the first time since I'd known him as a son-in-law that I'd ever seen him look genuinely uncertain about what came next. The recess lasted 20 minutes, though it felt considerably longer sitting in that gallery, watching Rodrigo confer quietly with his attorney, their heads bent together over a legal pad, while the rest of the room waited in a silence thick enough to have its own weight. When Wexler called the session back to order, something in the air had shifted, the way a harbor feels different in the hour before a storm actually arrives. Everyone present already bracing for weather they couldn't yet see. Regina didn't waste the recess either. She opened with the notary evidence directly this time, no preamble, sliding the 4 documents bearing Abigail's seal across the projector, one after another. Mr. French, did you know your sister was notarizing documents she hadn't actually witnessed you sign? I don't have direct knowledge of what Abigail did or didn't witness. The voluntary operational acknowledgement, bearing your father-in-law's forged signature, was created at 7:14 in the morning and notarized as signed in her presence at 2:41 that afternoon, a time during which Mr. Stevenson was sitting in Dr. McDaniel's exam room 66 miles away. Did you ask your sister to notarize that document? Rodrigo's jaw worked silently for a moment. I asked her to help expedite some paperwork. I didn't ask her to falsify a witness statement. But you knew your father-in-law hadn't actually signed it in her presence, because you knew he hadn't signed it at all. I believed the transfer was in everyone's best interest, Rodrigo said, his voice rising slightly. The first real crack I'd heard in it since the recess began. I believed if I could just get past the paperwork stage, Dad would eventually see that selling made sense, that keeping the lease was costing him more than it was worth, that his own refusal didn't matter, Regina said, as long as the documents said what you needed them to say instead. That's not... He stopped it again. I never wanted to hurt him. Did you believe forging his signature and his physician's letterhead would somehow not hurt him? Silence. Rodrigo looked toward Avery, seated in the gallery, and whatever he was hoping to find in her face, I watched him not find it. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead, refusing to give him the anchor he seemed to be reaching for. I made mistakes in how I handled the paperwork, Rodrigo said finally. I don't dispute that some of what was submitted wasn't accurate. Forged, Regina said. The word is forged, Mr. French, not inaccurate. Your own sister's notary seal certifies a moment that provably never happened. Dr. McDaniel has sworn in a recorded statement this board has already heard that he never wrote or authorized the letter bearing his name. These are not inaccuracies. They are fabrications built over 11 weeks, timed to a public festival announcement designed to make reversal as difficult as possible. Rodrigo said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that I heard the ceiling fan ticking overhead, the particular hush of a room full of people who had all, without discussing it, decided to stop breathing quite so audibly. Regina let the quiet sit a moment longer before she asked the question I understood even as she was asking it, would be the one this entire hearing had been built toward. Mr. French, if this board had ruled in your favor 9 days ago, and your father-in-law had been placed at Driftwood Manor as your petition requested, what did you imagine that would look like 6 months from now? Did you imagine he'd have simply adjusted? Rodrigo opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Did you imagine he'd wake up one morning in a facility he never chose, having lost a harbor his family held for 61 years, and simply decide the loss had been for the best? Still nothing. He stood there with his hands flat on the table, staring at some point past Regina's shoulder, and I watched a man who had spent 11 weeks building an elaborate structure of forged paper finally arrive at the one question none of that paper had ever been designed to answer. Wexler waited. The whole room waited. Somewhere behind me, Nola's cane tapped once against the floor. Soft, involuntary, the only sound in a silence that had stopped being merely quiet and become something closer to a held breath. The entire building seemed to be sharing. I don't know, Rodrigo said at last, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. I told myself I'd figure that part out later. Nobody spoke after that. Not Regina, who let the answer stand exactly as damning as it was without adding anything to it. Not Wexler, who set down his pen and folded his hands on the table in front of him. Not Avery, whose eyes had gone glassy but whose spine hadn't moved an inch. Not Rodrigo, who remained standing at the respondents' table because he seemed in that moment to have forgotten that sitting down again was an option available to him. Not the gallery, packed with fishermen who had known me most of my working life and now sat in a silence so complete I could hear the traffic passing on the street outside, ordinary and indifferent to everything that had just happened in this room. The quiet lasted long enough that it stopped feeling like an absence of sound and started feeling like its own kind of verdict, delivered by an entire room of people who had simply run out of anything left to say. I sat with that silence and found unexpectedly that it didn't feel like victory. I had spent 9 days wanting exactly this moment, wanting Rodrigo to stand in front of people who mattered and run out of ways to explain himself. Now that it had arrived, I felt mostly the particular grief of watching a structure finally collapse that I'd once foolishly believed was built to hold. He was still my daughter's husband. He was still Layla's father. Somewhere underneath 11 weeks of forged paper was still the young man who'd once asked my permission at this very harbor before he'd asked Avery to marry him. And I couldn't make that man and the one standing silent at the respondents' table resolve into a single simple person I knew how to feel only one thing about. Wexler finally broke it, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. The board has heard sufficient testimony and evidence today to render a decision. We'll take a brief recess to deliberate and return with our ruling before this session adjourns. The gavel came down once, and the sound of it seemed to release the whole room at once, 100 people exhaling in something close to unison, though nobody moved. Yet nobody entirely trusting that the silence had actually ended. The board returned 40 minutes later, and Wexler read the ruling himself, unhurried, the way a man reads something he wants understood correctly, rather than simply heard. The certificate of successor operator was voided in its entirety, the board finding clear and convincing evidence of forgery in both the physician's letter and the notarized acknowledgment supporting it. The transfer to Gulf Tide Holdings was declared null, the lease restored fully to my name, effective immediately. The board further ordered that its findings, along with the full evidentiary record, be forwarded to the county sheriff's office and the state attorney for criminal review, citing forgery fraud and what Wexler called, reading directly from his notes, a documented pattern of exploitation directed at a vulnerable elder through manufactured medical incapacity. Concern for an aging parent, Wexler said, looking directly at Rodrigo as he said it, does not entitle a son-in-law to manufacture that parent's incapacity in order to seize control of what he cannot yet inherit. Expected inheritance is not present ownership, Mr. French. Repeating the word family does not transform theft into care. The gavel came down once, final, this time, and I felt something in my chest release that had been held tight since a folding chair on a festival morning 9 days earlier. 2 sheriff's deputies were waiting near the meeting room's side door, having apparently coordinated with Regina's office once the criminal referral became likely, and they approached Rodrigo's table with the unhurried professionalism of men who did this often enough not to need to hurry. Rodrigo stood when they asked him to, his face gone the particular gray of a man finally understanding that a hearing room and a courtroom weren't in the end 2 different kinds of consequence. He looked at me once on his way past, and for half a second I thought he might say something. He didn't. He looked at Avery instead, seated in the gallery, and whatever passed between them in that half-second, I wasn't able to read it, and I suspected Avery herself might not have fully known what she felt either. I watched the deputies walk him out through the side door past the fisherman who'd known him as my son-in-law for 18 years, and felt none of the satisfaction I'd half expected to feel at this exact moment back when it had still felt impossibly far away. Instead, I thought of the harbor the way it had looked the morning after Lorelei's funeral, familiar and functioning and completely unable to explain to me why grief hadn't simply stopped it from continuing on schedule. Rodrigo leaving through that door didn't stop anything either. It only marked officially the moment one kind of trouble ended and an entirely different kind began. I found Avery in the hallway afterward, standing near a water fountain with her arms wrapped around herself the same way she'd stood at the festival. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. The $11,000, I said finally. I need to understand it, Avery, before anything else gets decided today. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. I knew something was coming, she said. Not everything. Not the forged letter, not Abigail, not the video, but I knew Rodrigo had been talking to someone about the harbor for weeks, and I knew whatever it was going to hurt you, and I panicked and pulled cash out before the accounts froze because some part of me thought I could give it back to you quietly later once this all settled, without you ever knowing I'd been close enough to see it coming and hadn't stopped it. Why didn't you stop it? Because he's my husband, she said. And her voice cracked on the word, in a way that told me the sentence cost her something to say out loud. And because I kept telling myself if I just waited he'd come to his senses on his own, the way he always eventually did about smaller things. I didn't understand how far this one had already gone until it was too late to simply wait him out of it. Before I could answer her, a woman from the board's administrative office approached with a folder, apologizing for the interruption, explaining that as part of the restitution accounting, several misappropriated accounts had been identified for return, including one that had caught her attention specifically. She opened the folder. A partial repayment drawn from French Marine Construction's frozen assets had been earmarked for return to an education account originally established in Layla's name. The same account Rodrigo had quietly redirected mailing addresses on and used as loan collateral 18 months earlier without my knowledge or Layla's consent. I stood in that hallway, holding proof that even the money meant to carry my granddaughter cleanly through school had been treated at some point as simply more material available for building Rodrigo's structure, and felt the full shape of what this family had allowed itself to become settle over me one final time that day. Avery watched my face change as I read it. "Dad," she said quietly, "am I still your daughter?" I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd once balanced a paper checkbook at 10 years old, with columns straight as a ruler, who'd panicked and grabbed what she could reach rather than confront what was coming directly, who'd stood in a gallery today and refused her husband the anchor of her face, even as some older, more complicated loyalty kept her from fully condemning him either. I didn't have an answer ready yet, and for the first time in 9 days, I let myself say so honestly instead of reaching for something gentler. "I don't know yet," I said. "I need time before that becomes something I can answer honestly, instead of just kindly." 8 months passed before either of us found out what the honest answer actually was. Nola died the way she'd lived, correcting 3 errors in the nursery's account books over breakfast, before her heart simply decided with the same quiet decisiveness she'd brought to every argument she'd ever won, that it had done enough work for one lifetime. The funeral filled the largest greenhouse on her property, folding chairs set between rows of citrus trees she'd planted decades before either of us had ever met, and half of Harbor Point turned out to say goodbye to a woman most of them had known only as the sharp-tongued former county clerk who'd once made their permit applications considerably more difficult than necessary. I placed her cane beside the memorial table, not as a symbol of frailty, but as the instrument she'd used to tap impatiently at every man who'd ever underestimated her. She left the nursery to a community land trust rather than to any single person, a nonprofit she'd spent her final months quietly organizing with a lawyer I hadn't even known she'd hired. The trust kept the greenhouses running, but redirected the profits toward transportation legal aid and a set of small guest cottages for elderly people leaving hospitals without anyone safe to take them in. She'd named the program Second Tide because, as her final letter to the board explained, everyone deserved a second current to carry them somewhere better than where the first one had left them stranded. I didn't inherit the land and hadn't expected to. What I did in the months after her death was finally restructure how Harbor Point's dock lease was governed, converting my sole authority into a 5-member fishermen's council with myself as chair. Ray Delgado among the members. Decisions requiring a majority rather than a single aging man's signature on a single afternoon. It was not a diminishment. It was the harbor finally protected by more hands than the ones that had nearly lost it to a folder with a county seal on it. Layla's education account restored in full through the restitution order I signed back over to her, entirely refusing even the portion Regina insisted I was legally owed. She'd earned that money twice over, once by being born into a family that should have protected her without condition, and once by protecting me herself when nobody had asked her to. She and Nico had not resolved anything by the time I visited the county correctional facility for the first time 8 months into Rodrigo's sentence. That particular wound might take considerably longer than mine to heal, and I'd stopped expecting every relationship in this story to close as neatly as a courtroom docket. The visitation room held bolted chairs and a bank of vending machines, fluorescent light flattening everyone under it into the same shade of tired. Rodrigo looked thinner than I remembered, gray threading through a beard he'd never worn before, and when he sat down across from me, neither of us spoke for a long moment. "I read Lorelei's letter," he said finally. "Avery brought me a copy after the sentencing. What did you hear in it? That I treated your life like a delay standing between me and mine starting. He didn't look away when he said it, which surprised me more than the words themselves. Can you forgive me? Forgiveness isn't a door I walk through once, and I'm simply through it, I said. Some mornings I think I can see it up ahead. Other mornings I'm back on that festival platform hearing you tell a camera crew I'd retired. I don't know which morning I'll be having on any given day, and I've stopped pretending I do. Will we ever be a family again? We're a family right now, I said. That's exactly why all of this cost what it cost. What we become after this depends on whether you can build something with me that doesn't require me to forget what actually happened to get us here. He nodded, and it wasn't a reunion, and it wasn't nothing either. And I drove back to Harbor Point that afternoon without any tidy word for what it had actually been. The following spring, I received a call from a young woman named Priya Fontaine, 26 years old, who'd just lost her family's dock lease 3 towns north after a cousin forged a signature on a refinancing document nobody had caught until the bank came calling. She'd heard somehow that Harbor Point had a council now instead of a single owner, and wondered whether anyone there might understand what she was going through. I drove up myself rather than sending someone else. I found her sitting on an overturned bucket at the end of an empty dock, staring at water that no longer belonged on paper to anyone in her family. 61 years, my family held our lease, I told her, sitting down on the bucket beside hers. And for about 9 of the worst days of my life, I thought all 61 of those years were about to become somebody else's story instead of mine. They weren't. They're still mine. They're still standing. I nodded toward the harbor, stretching gray and steady behind her. Yours can still be standing too. It just needs more hands helping hold it than the ones you've been trying to hold it with alone. That evening back at Harbor Point, I walked out to the net shed behind what had once been Nola's cottage and was now, by the trust's own arrangement, mine to keep as long as I wanted it. The old, unfinished net still hung on its hook, repaired now, every knot retied over the past 8 months in the quiet hours when sleep hadn't come easily. I'd hung it near the dock's entrance instead of leaving it in the shed, a small, strange monument nobody but Layla and I understood the full meaning of. I stood at the head of the dock as the light went copper over the water, reached up and rang the old ship's bell the way I had every morning for 44 years now. One ring for the tide, one for the boats still out, one for the ones already home. This time I wasn't counting alone. Layla stood beside me, her hand resting near mine on the worn rope, waiting for the sound to finish traveling out over water that, however imperfectly, however expensively, was still ours. The net still hangs by the dock's entrance every morning, now salt stiff and patched in places where the old cord gave out and new line had to be spliced in to hold. Some mornings the wind catches it just enough to make it sway slow, the way a thing moves when it's finally allowed to rest instead of being carried. The bell hangs quiet beside it, waiting for hands that are no longer only mine. I used to believe that holding everything alone was the same thing as holding it safely, that a man who needed nobody could never be made to look the way I looked on a screen in a lawyer's office, confused and unguarded and easy to disbelieve. I was wrong about that in a way it cost me nearly everything to learn. The very solitude I trusted to protect what I'd built turned out to be the one condition that made it possible to take. What actually held the harbor in the end wasn't my grip on it. It was every hand that finally joined mine on the rope once I stopped insisting on holding it by myself. I think God puts certain people in our path exactly when our own strength runs out, not to rescue us from the consequences of what we built, but to stand beside us while we rebuild it honestly. I don't know why God let a sharp-tongued old woman with a cane be the one waiting in that hallway the exact morning I needed her most. I only know I'm grateful, and I pray, God willing, that when someone else's folding chair gets pulled out from under them, I'm the one standing close enough to notice. If you were in my place, if the person who was supposed to protect you turned out to be the one you needed protecting from, could you have stood at that podium and told the truth anyway, knowing it might cost you the family you had left? I'd genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments what you would have done or what you did if something like this has already happened in your own family. And if this story found something true in you, stay a while longer. There are more people on this channel who learned the hard way that the strongest hands are rarely the ones working entirely alone.